Hello, my name is Russell Carr, and welcome to this presentation of my free report, The 5 Most Dangerous EHS Compliance Risks Facing Small Manufacturers and How to Manage Them and Protect Your Business. All right, before getting started, I wanted to share with you some background information about the report and why I created it. So this report actually began as a research project several years ago after I witnessed some really bad things happen to companies and people I've known throughout my career as a direct result of failing to manage environmental health and safety regulations. I'm going to share some of these stories during the report, which include seeing one of my very first clients get convicted and sent to jail over environmental violations, and the entire management team of another client get threatened with jail time after the company was raided by EPA and TCEQ due to other serious environmental violations. I'll tell you more about these stories and others throughout the report so you can see what can happen not only to companies, but even ownership and management when they fail to keep up with these regulations. It's the culmination of 6 months of detailed research combined with my own 19-plus year career in the EHS field, working with manufacturing companies, as well as 15 years as a small business owner running my own 3 contracting businesses that had their own major EHS compliance requirements and risks. And by the way, in full disclosure, I also really struggled to keep up with these regulations while running my companies and was even cited by OSHA and TCEQ for violations. So believe me, I know how it feels. Through it all, I've learned firsthand how incredibly difficult it is for small companies to manage the long list of OSHA, EPA, state environmental, and DOT regulations that impact them and the devastating risks that they face for failing to do so. I've been presenting this report to small business owners and management teams for years, and it's always been very well received and provoked great conversation and questions due to its educational approach and factual content. I hope that you find the information in the report helpful, and most of all, that it encourages and motivates you to take action towards achieving compliance and risk reduction at your company soon. All right, so let's settle in and learn more about how to achieve compliance and avoid risks at your company. And with that said, let's get on with it. All right, hello and welcome to this presentation of our free report, The 5 Most Dangerous EHS Compliance Risks Facing Small Manufacturers and How to Manage Them and Protect Your Company. It's a long-winded title, I know, but also very important because this is what we're going to be talking about today throughout this presentation. All right, so I'd like to start by telling you a little bit more about why I commissioned this study and then tell you a little bit more about what we're going to be covering today. So as I mentioned in the introduction, I've seen some really bad things happen to people and companies throughout my career as a direct result of failing to manage environmental health and safety regulations. And these situations really got me thinking about how and why these things happen, and more importantly, what steps people can take to manage and avoid them. In addition, I've had my own compliance struggles while operating 3 contracting businesses that I owned with major EHS compliance requirements. I'm not immune from this. I know how tough it is for a small company to keep up with these regulations. Also, I've been in the environmental health and safety business for over 19 years now, and a key statistic that I've uncovered during that time is the fact that up to 90% of manufacturers, especially small to medium-sized ones, are routinely out of compliance and therefore at risk for huge losses that most small manufacturers either aren't aware of or don't believe could ever happen to them. And I'm talking about things like huge regulatory fines and penalties, major financial losses, PR nightmares, and sometimes even civil and criminal liabilities if things go wrong. So as a way of helping out our existing clients and local business, I eventually decided to conduct a study to get a better understanding of these issues and how to manage and avoid them. So this report is really designed to do 3 things. Number 1, make you aware of these risks. Number 2, how potentially damaging they can be to you and your business. And number 3, and most importantly, what you can do to manage and avoid them. And also, we're going to talk about all the benefits of doing so. There are a lot of benefits, and we'll cover that towards the end of this presentation. Okay, so let's continue by revisiting one of the points that I just made, which is that many small companies and people don't believe that any of these things could ever happen to them. And I'm going to go ahead and refer to this as denial. And I'll use this perfect picture to illustrate the point, When you're in denial, you're really walking on a tightrope high up in the sky with a blindfold on, and that is not a good combination when it comes to failing to manage EHS compliance within a manufacturing company. And the problem is that denial actually leads to greatly increased risk of these bad things happening to any given company. And that's exactly what I found out was the root cause in most, if not all, of the cases of these bad things that I witnessed throughout my career. All of these impacted people and companies had three things in common. Number one, they didn't think it could ever happen to them. Number two, they weren't keeping up with these regulations. And number three, one day it finally caught up with them. And so now I'm going to give you a couple of actual real life examples of what this sort of denial can actually lead to. And this first example is actually one that I was personally involved with, and it involved one of the very first clients of my hazardous waste management company. And here's what happened. So this business owner, who again I knew personally, was sent to jail over environmental issues. And here's a quick summary of what happened. So the company was a small parts and coating manufacturer in Texas. There were two major violations involved here. Number one, he was illegally storing hazardous waste. And number two, he was failing to properly dispose of hazardous waste. And I actually warned him about this and tried to help him over a period of time. Unfortunately, he chose not to listen and not to take action. And here was the aftermath of that decision. His landlord found out about it, about the violations, and ended up turning him into the authorities. So officials from EPA, TCEQ, and Texas Parks and Wildlife, these are the three agencies that investigate and prosecute environmental crimes in Texas. They investigated the situation and charged the owner with these two violations. So eventually the owner was unfortunately convicted and sent to prison over these issues. He also suffered major fines and penalties. And to make matters worse, the local media picked up on it, and that coverage led to major public embarrassment, not only for him, but for his family and for his business. So this is a really bad situation. And it was actually my first exposure to what can happen to a company for failing to keep up with these regulations. Again, it had a major impact on me, but unfortunately, it was not the last time I saw something bad happen to companies over these issues. And here's yet another example of what can happen to a manufacturing company for failing to manage OSHA regulations. So in 2017, Duracon Incorporated, a Texas manufacturer, they were fined $459,918 after a single employee complaint, which is a real common trigger for OSHA inspections, which resulted in 25 violations. So there were multiple serious, repeat, and willful violations, including failure to manage a hearing conservation program, multiple lockout tagout violations, failure to implement a confined space program, failure to provide forklift training, various electrical violations, multiple respiratory protection program violations, and multiple machine guarding violations. And a lot of these violations are very common because they're very complicated and very difficult for small companies to keep up with. And so, as you can see in this example, OSHA inspectors are actually very good at finding and citing all of these different violations that can quickly add up to huge fines and penalties for companies that aren't prepared. And we're going to talk a lot more about these issues throughout this report. Okay, so I'm going to break up the remainder of the presentation into 5 main sections, and here they are. Number one, we're going to talk about the latest environmental health and safety compliance trends and risks. We're going to focus mostly on OSHA health and safety compliance issues, and that's because we find that this is where most small companies really struggle, but also because OSHA is currently very much more aggressive in their enforcement efforts than the environmental agencies. But we'll also talk about environmental risks, mainly because their fines are actually much higher than OSHA's. And as you saw in the example I just gave you, they'll hold ownership and even management much more criminally accountable than OSHA does, believe it or not. So you'll want to stick around for that. Then we're going to talk about the 5 most common small business compliance mistakes and myths made. This is really important. This is one of the major findings that I had. So right alongside denial. These common mistakes and myths that we see small companies make all the time often trigger and lead to all these risks and liabilities that we're talking about today. So again, you'll want to stick around for that as well. Then we're going to summarize the 5 most dangerous EHS compliance risks facing small manufacturing companies today. Then we'll transition to the solution part of the report. We're going to talk about the 7 keys to managing compliance. And then we're going to end off by talking about how compliance will actually protect and improve your business. So a lot of small companies, business owners, management, they think of, compliance as, a time-consuming, expensive hassle that they have to deal with. But what they don't realize are all the benefits that come along with managing compliance, like growing the company, long-term sustainability, reducing employee turnover, et cetera. A lot of benefits that come along with this. So I think you'll really enjoy that part of the presentation. Okay, so let's talk about recent OSHA enforcement trends. So I'm not sure if you're aware of this or not, but in August of 2016, they actually increased fines by 78% to account for inflation since the last time they did increases a long time ago. And now, moving forward, there's going to be annual increases again to account for inflation. So to give you an idea of what that means, so for serious violations, which are the most common type, and even other than serious, prior to the increase, there were a maximum of $7,000 each. Today, the maximum is $13,260 per serious violation. All right, and for willful and repeat violations, and I'll talk more later on about what that means, prior to the increases, the maximum was $70,000 per, which is high enough, bad enough, but today it's actually $132,598 per violation. And this unfortunately ends up happening to a lot of companies, and we'll again talk more about that in a moment here. Okay, so OSHA can inspect your business at any time and without warning. And if they do so, there's no timeouts, there's no do-overs. They have the authority to immediately walk through your entire operation. They can conduct private confidential interviews with your staff and managers that you're not privy to. They can inspect all of your written programs, all of your training records, etc. So this can be a very time-consuming and disruptive thing. So you really need to be prepared for that possibility because it happens every single day to small companies, small manufacturing companies across the country. Citations and fines are issued in over 75% of OSHA inspections. And even companies who believe that they are in compliance are still found to have violations and get fined 60 to 70% of the time. And as we mentioned before, these inspectors are very good at finding and citing all kinds of low-hanging fruit. And by that I mean all the common, easy-to-spot violations that most small manufacturing companies miss. And keep in mind that these violations can fall into 4 major areas. Number 1, physical hazards out on the plant floor, which are the most commonly cited violations, like machine guarding issues, damaged electrical cords, etc. They can also cite you for written program requirements. They can cite you for failure to have employee training records, etc., and even record-keeping requirements like your OSHA 300 logs. Okay, so the average OSHA inspection at a manufacturing company is going to result in fines anywhere between $30,000 and $80,000 per inspection, believe it or not. And that's because on average, they're going to find anywhere between 5 and 10 serious violations, which on average are going to result in a fine of about $7,300 per, based on our experience after everything is said and done. But again, they can max out at over $13,000 after the recent hikes. And unfortunately, fines can easily exceed $100,000, $200,000, or $300,000, or even $400,000 per inspection for unprepared companies. And these high fine inspections typically result from those willful and repeat violations that I talked about earlier that can max out at over $132,000 each. And I'll talk more about that in a moment here. And companies without a qualified safety professional are at a much higher risk for fines and penalties. And that's because OSHA standards can be complex, difficult to interpret and apply to your operations. I don't know if you've ever tried to log on to the OSHA website to read and interpret their standards, then write a written program that addresses all those requirements, that is customized to your operations, and then actually implement and manage it on your with your company on an ongoing basis. That's very difficult to do. You need to have a qualified and experienced safety professional to manage these issues for your company. Okay, so let's talk about what can trigger an OSHA inspection. So there's actually many different triggers, including industry-specific programs. For example, in the past, they've targeted the steel fabrication industry. But there's also hazard-specific programs. For example, they'll go after companies that have historically high noise levels or high amputation risks that they'll target, but also high injury rates. So if your company has a high TRIR or DART score, you now have to report that electronically to OSHA every year. And if you exceed a certain threshold, that can trigger a comprehensive inspection at your company. We've seen that happen several times to companies, and those comprehensive inspections can result in the highest number of fines and penalties. So keep that in mind. You want to keep those injury rates low to prevent that from happening at your company. Another statistic is the fact that 25% of all inspections are actually triggered by an employee complaint. That can be a current employee or one that you fired or laid off up to 6 months ago. They can all turn you into OSHA, and OSHA is mandated to follow up and investigate all those complaints. And so the point is, it's really important to implement health and safety programs at your company so that your employees know that you take this stuff seriously and they won't turn you in to the agency. Okay, so let's talk about significant enforcement case. A significant enforcement case is any inspection that results in fines that exceed $100,000. And since 2007, there's between 2007 and 2013, there was a greater than 100% increase in these cases. OSHA stopped publishing data on this, but I regularly monitor enforcement, and I haven't seen any sort of a real slowdown. They happen on a weekly basis. So even if the increases haven't continued, they still happen on a regular basis. So you really want to be aware of this possibility. And again, here's an example of one of these significant enforcement cases that we pointed out earlier, where Duracon in Texas was fined $459,918. And really what they're trying to do in these cases is to identify and justify what are called willful violations that I referred to earlier. And a willful violation is when they can prove that an employer was aware of a serious hazard but failed to do anything about it. And again, the maximum penalty for each one of these is now over $132,000. So you get one willful, you're already in a significant enforcement case situation. But what we see on a regular basis are fines exceeding $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 when this happens. And again, that can just be devastating for a business. They don't care if you're a big company or a small company. They issue them to any size company where they can prove that there's a willful violation. And they typically find this out by doing confidential interviews with staff members and management that ownership and senior management can't be involved with. And so if there was something there at your company that you knew was a safety hazard, they're going to find out about it. And so you've got to take action to prevent this from happening. Okay, so let's talk about how this concept of willfulness can lead to criminal and civil liability for a business owner. So this is kind of a long-winded slide, but let's go ahead and go through this in detail. It's important stuff. So if an employer is convicted of a willful violation of an OSHA standard that results in the death of an employee, the offense is punishable by a court-imposed fine or for imprisonment for up to 6 months or both. So a fine of up to $250,000 for an individual or $500,000 for a corporation may be imposed for a criminal conviction. Serious stuff, but again, totally preventable. So here's an example of an actual case where a business owner is facing criminal charges. So Mr. Martin Romano, president of MR Asphalt in Montana, he had an employee who died after falling 15 feet from an oil tank, which is bad enough, but there was a willful violation that resulted from an investigation of the fatality. which was a failure to provide a guardrail or fall protection. So now, as a result of this, they were able to prove that Mr. Romano knew about this need for a guardrail, did nothing about it. Now he faces up to 6 months in prison, a $10,000 personal fine, and a $500,000 corporate fine. Again, this is devastating stuff that literally could not only destroy a business, but destroy a life. 2 lives here. The employee who died and the business owner who knew about a hazard but failed to do anything about it. This can't happen. You've got to prevent these things from happening by knowing if you have any serious safety hazards at your company, and if you do, you've got to take action to remediate it. Okay, so let's talk about worker injuries and devastating potential civil lawsuit liability. So in addition to these huge OSHA fines and penalties that we've been talking about, potential civil lawsuits could add millions in additional costs and penalties to a business and a business owner and could destroy a company, especially a small company. So the point here is that if an employee gets seriously injured, either they or a family member could team up with a personal injury lawyer and sue the company for settlements that often add up into the millions. And here's an example of that happening. So here's an example of a civil lawsuit won by an injured worker in Texas. So in Houston in 2008, a welder sustained severe burns after a tank exploded while he was welding on it. And the worker claimed that the owner was aware of dangerous conditions but failed to warn him. So right there's the willful component. He was able to prove that the owner knew about it and didn't do anything about it, and that resulted in the injury. And as a result, the welder was awarded $2.125 million. And again, most small companies just could not survive this. Yet another reminder of the importance of knowing your workplace, identifying any serious safety hazards, remediating them, and controlling them to prevent this kind of a disaster that could wreck your business. Okay, so I'd like to wrap up this portion of the presentation by covering some OSHA-mandated employer responsibilities. These are some of the 5 key standards that OSHA requires of a typical manufacturer, but also some of the standards that manufacturing companies really struggle to keep up with. So this is kind of going to be sort of a checkup for you to see if you have these things in place. All right, so we'll start off with the HAZCOM program. So that's an abbreviation for the Hazard Communication Program, which is OSHA's chemical safety standard. So some of the key elements that you have to have in place under the standard, you have to have a written program that meets the OSHA standards. That written program needs to document where you keep your safety data sheets. And you have to also document how your employees are given access to those safety data sheets. That's one of the key requirements, is that your employees need to have access to them so that they understand what the hazards are with all the chemicals that you have in your workplace. Then you have to train your employees on how to read and understand your safety data sheets, and then you have to document that training. And also keep in mind that OSHA did a major update on the hazard communication standard a few years ago to meet the global harmonized standard, and a lot of companies aren't aware of that and haven't updated their HAZCOM program. Also keep in mind that if OSHA inspects you, their standard operating procedure, one of the first things they're going to ask for is a copy of your HAZCOM program, and then they're going to check to see if you are managing all those elements that I talked about. Another key one is the PPE program, which is your personal protective equipment program. Some of the key elements there, you have to have a written program, again, that meets the standard. Then you have to conduct hazard assessments for every job task in your plant floor. And then you have to sign off on those hazard assessments and keep those on file in case you get inspected. And then you have to train your employees on those hazard assessments and how to use the personal protective equipment that you provide to them, which is another requirement of the PPE standard, and document that training. Again, a lot of companies don't have those hazard assessments in place. Lockout tagout, that's a real big one, a very commonly cited standard because it's very difficult to keep up with, and I'm going to go through some of those requirements right now. So again, you got to have a written program that meets the standard. Then you have to develop equipment-specific lockout tagout procedures for every piece of equipment that you have that meets the standard with multiple energy sources. And then you have to train your employees on how to follow those equipment-specific lockout tagout procedures. And there's actually two different types of training. You have to do authorized training for the people who will actually do the maintenance and services on your equipment. And then you have to do affected training for all the rest of your employees so that they understand what locks and tags mean when that maintenance work is going on. Then another key requirement is that you have to do annual audits on those lockout tagout procedures to make sure that your authorized employees are following those procedures. So it's a lot to keep up with, and depending on the company and how much energized equipment you have, a lot of companies really struggle to keep up with that. And again, it's one of the top cited violations every year by OSHA. Then you have your OSHA 300 logs. This is a key record-keeping requirement to log all of your injury and illnesses at the company. You have to do all the OSHA 300 logs. You have to post them every year for 2 months for your employees to be able to see them. If you get inspected, another standard operating procedure from OSHA is that they're going to ask for your last 5 years of OSHA 300 logs. If you don't have them, those are citations. And that applies to any company that has 11 or more employees during the previous calendar year. Then another key requirement that OSHA has is conducting routine safety inspections to identify and correct safety hazards. So I'm talking about things like machine guarding, blocked exits, damaged electrical cords. Again, as I mentioned before, most citations come from physical hazards that are identified during an inspection. So companies have to conduct these routine inspections to identify and correct those safety hazards. And if you don't, you're going to be exposed to major fines and penalties. So again, the question is, in the summary, are you covering all your bases? Are you managing all these things on a routine basis? These are just 5 of the key requirements, but there's a lot more than this. Okay, so now we're going to transition into talking about environmental compliance trends and risks. All right, so environmental fines and penalties, believe it or not, are not capped and could include jail time. So legal fines and penalties for environmental violations can easily and quickly run into the millions of dollars, much higher than on the OSHA side. So how can fines be so high? The reason is that federal laws allow for 2 ways to calculate and assess environmental fines. And let's talk about both of these briefly. So number 1 is they can assess daily fines for each day that the company was out of compliance. So let's take air permitting, for example. So if a company was required to have an air permit and they get cited for that, the agency can look back to the very first day that the company should have been in compliance and assess a daily fine for each day that the company was out of compliance from that day to the present. And that daily fine can be in the thousands of dollars. So if a company has been out of compliance for years, then you can see how quickly these fines can add up. If there's a daily, $1,000 fine or $2,000 fine, it doesn't take long. The other tool that they have for assessing fines is the total economic benefit that the company gained for being out of compliance. So again, let's take air permitting as an example. The agency can go back again to the first day that the company should have had an air permit in place, and they can calculate during that time up to present time what that economic benefit was that that company achieved for not being in compliance. And that can include capital expenditures for scrubbers, for example, or other engineering controls to maintain that permit. That could include time and energy, money spent on that air permit, payroll for an environmental health and safety manager to manage that permit, or for hiring a consulting fee, state and federal air permitting fees, and so forth. So whatever that total dollar amount ends up being, they can fine that company for that total economic benefit for that entire period of time. So again, it doesn't take long for these huge fines to add up. Also, environmental fines and penalties can include jail time. So federal environmental laws hold corporate officers and even employees and managers personally responsible for violations. This includes both criminal fines and jail time, unfortunately. All All right, so here's an example of what that can actually look like in real life. And unfortunately, this was one of those cases where I knew the company very well. I knew the people who were impacted. This is a client of mine in the past in Texas. So business owners and management team were threatened with jail time. And here's kind of a summary of what happened. So the company was kind of a high-tech parts cleaning and coating operation. And the violation involved a rogue employee discharging untreated hazardous waste down the drain. So the company generated a large amount of liquid hazardous waste. They had a big treatment system with a wastewater discharge permit that was violated. So obviously they had a requirement to treat that waste before discharging it, but this employee violated that discharge permit. And so here is the aftermath of that event. The city began noticing slugs of this material coming down the drain, and over time began researching and tracking back until they were finally able to identify the violating company. They conducted an investigation over time, and then literally one day, officials from EPA, TCEQ, and police actually raided the company. They rounded up all the employees, had them come outside, and then they rounded up the management team and apparently brought them into the conference room and, obviously told them what was going on and eventually threatened all of them with jail time. I'll never forget that day when I got the call from one of my contacts at the company, telling me about what had happened. It was quite a traumatic day for everybody. So ownership and management were threatened with jail time again. To make matters worse, local press coverage resulted in a PR nightmare. One of those situations where there's a helicopter flying overhead. It's a headline on the local news and the local newspaper. Major public embarrassment for the company and management team there. They lost a lot of business over it. And again, obviously huge fines and penalties for the company. In the end, the management team was not sent to jail. But one of the guys, just a quick side story here, one of the guys on the management team, I knew him pretty well. We played golf on a regular basis. And after this happened, I literally, never saw him again. This is a real happy-go-lucky guy who got wrapped up in this. He wasn't the cause of it, but he was held responsible for it. And, really wrecked his life. It took months for the investigation to unfold. And during that time, he and everybody else had the specter of jail time hanging over them. So you can only imagine, the stress and the worry involved in that. Just a really terrible situation. Okay, and here's another example of an environmental enforcement case with significant fines and actual jail time for staff managers. So the company is Atlantic States Cast Iron Pipe Company in New Jersey. They're actually fined $8 million for multiple environmental violations. Unreal, $8 million fine involved there. And that included jail time for 3 managers sentenced to federal prison terms. 70 months for the plant manager, this guy, John Prisk. 41 months for the HR manager, Scott Faubert. And 30 months for Jeffrey Maury, who is the maintenance manager. So again, in the first example, the staff managers were able to stay out of jail. In this example, they were not. And a statement from the prosecutor kind of summed it up. He said, this case should serve as an example for company execs and plant managers ignoring environmental laws and disregard for workers' lives and limbs will be met with prosecution and stiff sentences, including multi-million-dollar fines and prison time. Okay, so this next slide is going to look kind of familiar. So what can trigger an inspection? So environmental inspections are often triggered by complaints, just like on the OSHA side. A competitor, believe it or not, can turn you in. Your neighbor can turn you in. That could be a nearby residential area or a neighboring business. An employee of yours or one of their friends and family members who may have heard from an employee that there might be a violation going on. A former disgruntled employee or employees could turn you in. Police or EMS personnel can turn you in. Basically, anyone who sees or thinks that they see a violation can turn you into the agency. And this could be, for example, what we've seen in the past is a plume of smoke coming out of the top of the building could trigger something. Some sort of suspect contamination outside the building that people might drive by and see. All these things can trigger a complaint. And in Texas, TCEQ or EPA is mandated to follow up on all these complaints, just like OSHA is. So, obviously a reminder to make sure that you're keeping up with all your environmental compliance regulations to ensure that this doesn't happen. But of course, that's a lot easier said than done. And that's due to the complexity of environmental and hazardous materials rules and regulations that a typical manufacturer has to deal with. So manufacturers are accountable to multiple federal, state, and local agencies, again, adding to the complexity. For example, in Texas, manufacturers have to answer on a federal level to EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. At the state level, we have TCEQ, Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. But every state has their own state-level environmental agency. You got to deal with your local city or town. You got to deal with your local fire department. And if you ship off hazardous materials, you've got to deal with U.S. Department of Transportation and sometimes your state-level DOT agency. And then each one of these agencies enforces a wide range of environmental and hazardous materials rules and regulations. Okay, and to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, I'm going to give you a quick rundown, a quick summary of some of the most common environmental regulations that trigger at a typical manufacturing company. So, number one, stormwater permit, stormwater pollution prevention plan. This triggers by SIC code, and virtually every manufacturing SIC code is impacted. And a lot of manufacturing companies in our experience don't even know about this regulation. But anyway, it requires developing a customized plan for your facility, and training your employees, pulling rain samples, etc. A lot of work that goes into managing these plans. Spill prevention, control, and countermeasure. This is designed to help control the accidental spill of oils and diesel fuel, etc. if your company exceeds the storage threshold for SPCC. Wastewater discharge permit. So if your company has a wastewater treatment system, you have to get a discharge permit and meet the requirements of that permit, which means pulling samples on a regular basis, sending it off to the lab, sometimes employee training, etc., to make sure that you follow those regulations. I gave an example earlier of that former client of mine that didn't do that, and boy, that led to all kinds of problems. Industrial and hazardous waste management, there's a lot here. So number one, you've got to determine what your company's generator status is, either very small quantity, or large quantity. And depending on what your status is, there's a lot of requirements that go along with that you have to manage. Employee training on an annual basis. You got to learn how to characterize your waste streams. You got to learn how to fill out and sign a manifest. You have to do annual reporting. And then there's another requirement to develop a pollution prevention plan that's pretty extensive. So if you're a small quantity or a large quantity generator, it triggers a lot of these requirements. Air emissions. This is another real common area where companies are deficient. In Texas, we have authorizations and permits. Those authorizations are called permits by rule, or PBRs, and there's literally over 200 of them in Texas, and virtually every manufacturer has these emissions within their facility. You have to go through and assess which ones trigger at your company, formally claim them. Some of them require for you to track emissions to make sure that you even qualify for a PBR. If not, that might trigger the requirement for a full-blown NSR air permit, or even a Title V air permit, and those are extensive requirements if that triggers at your company. And then on the hazardous materials side of things, if you're shipping off any hazardous materials via ground or air, that would then trigger DOT and IATA regulations. That primarily has to do with employee training to properly package and determine proper shipping names and documentation and so forth. And then if you store certain chemicals, hazardous materials, chemicals in excess of certain thresholds, then you have annual reporting requirements like Tier 2 and TRI. If you're over Edwards Aquifer in Central Texas or any aquifer, that can also trigger additional regulations. So this is, again, just a rundown of some of the most common environmental and hazardous materials regulations. There are more, but these are the ones that you typically run into for a manufacturing company. And again, it's a lot, and it depends on your operations, of course, but it's a lot to manage for a small manufacturing company. On a related note, there's some relief for this. There's something called the Texas Environmental Health and Safety Audit Privilege Act. And basically what it is, it's an environmental compliance incentive program that's geared for any size companies, but it's really good for small companies who don't believe or are worried that they're not in compliance and keeping up with all these regulations. And basically what it does is it protects non-compliant companies from fines and penalties if they meet three key requirements. I'm going to talk about those real quickly. Number one, you have to do a notice of audit where you formally let the agency know, TCEQ know, that you're going to do an audit, a self-audit on a particular date at this particular address. The second requirement is that you have to disclose all your violations back to the agency so that they know where you're out of compliance. And the third requirement, the big kicker, is that you have to commit to fixing all those problems within a reasonable period of time, which is usually 3 months, but you can get extensions if necessary. So this is a great program that you can participate in Texas if you are worried that you're not keeping up with these regulations, but you're afraid of fines and penalties. If you participate in this program and you meet all those three requirements, you will be protected from fines and penalties, and you can get your company into compliance and stop worrying about all these things. It's a great program. We've walked a lot of small companies through all this entire process, and it works really well. So keep that in mind. Okay, so now we're going to briefly talk about reputational risks associated with noncompliance, and this is really important. So we're going to start off by talking about OSHA's Regulation by Public Shaming Initiative, and bear with me as I read through this because it's very important. So according to Dr. David Michaels, former head of OSHA, the most effective means for OSHA to encourage elimination of life-threatening hazards is to publicize the names of violators, especially when their actions place the safety and health of workers in danger. And again, they actually dubbed this enforcement initiative Regulation by Shaming. So again, it's important to note that Michaels is no longer running OSHA. However, I routinely track enforcement cases and honestly haven't seen any real slowdown since he left. They're continuing on with this policy. And here's an example of what that can look like. So OSHA fined this company, Lobo Tortilla Factory in Dallas, over $123,000. And here's the statement that the OSHA enforcement official put out about the company. In the last 3 years, at least 7 workers have sustained injuries while performing maintenance work at this company. This company clearly knew its responsibilities under the Occupational Safety and Health Act, but continued to jeopardize the safety of its workers. Now, that's a pretty damning statement about a company. And imagine how this company felt about this when it happened, or any company when they get cited by OSHA. They know that they can bet that one of these press releases is going to come out about the company. Imagine how that would impact your company if that happened. And to compound the problem, once they issue a press release, media outlets will pick up on it and republish it. So here, for example, is what it looks like online. So if you do a search for this metal foundry in Temple, Texas, they were fined back in 2015. If you do a search for the company name, just the company name, this will come up. And it takes up more than one page, and it's all about this fine that happened back in 2015. So once it's published, it's out there forever. You can't delete it. You can't erase it. And not only online, but it'll media outlets like trade journals, local newspapers will republish it. So when you add it all up, everyone can read this. Your competitors can read it. Worst of all, your customers can read it. And then the local community can read it. And that impacts your recruiting and your workforce. I mean, who wants to work for a company who doesn't take safety seriously? And they go out and they do the research about an employer and they see they got fined by OSHA. So it's going to have a major impact across the spectrum for a company. It's hard to measure that negative impact, but obviously it's huge. And of course, this can happen on the environmental side as well. So, it takes years for a company to develop a good reputation, but only a moment to destroy it. And according to Intuit, the number one threat to the survival of any business is a negative or a poor reputation. So important, very important to keep this in mind. Okay, guys, now we're going to talk about the 5 most common EHS compliance mistakes and myths when it comes to small businesses. And this is one of the most important slides of the entire presentation, so bear with me as we work our way through this. So as I mentioned before, these mistakes and myths are very often the root cause of compliance failure, which can lead to all these risks and liabilities that I've been talking about. And so now I'm going to go through each one of these one by one so you can learn more about them and, more importantly, how to avoid them. So here's the first one. Dual tasking, a single staff manager or multiple managers with EHS compliance. This is by far the most common mistake that we see, where a company taps a staff manager like HR or operations with the responsibility of managing EHS for the company. A related mistake is tasking multiple managers, which only compounds the problem. So this strategy never works for 2 basic reasons. Number one, these people never have enough time to devote to this task, and that's because their primary role with the company is always given priority because it contributes to the company's bottom line. So they never have time. They've got to focus on their primary responsibility. There's really no time or not enough time left over for compliance. And number 2, even if they did have the time, these managers almost always lack the required experience and technical knowledge to keep up. And you'll see what I'm talking about when I discuss this in more detail in a few minutes. Regardless, this strategy never works. And I know from experience because I made the same mistake when I ran my own companies, and I always wondered how come my manager's not keeping up and getting the safety program going? How come my manager's not managing these environmental issues? They never had the time and they didn't understand the regulations. It wasn't fair. So again, we see this happen all the time, and I know how it can happen. I made the mistake myself. Okay, now we're going to talk about probably the second most common mistake and myth that we see out there. This is a very common one that we see, and it's the idea where a company believes that their insurance company is managing their OSHA compliance for them. And that's impossible for 3 primary reasons that I'm going to summarize here. Number 1, your workman's comp carrier has no mandate to manage OSHA compliance for their clients. Their only mandate is to conduct an annual loss control assessment, not an OSHA compliance assessment, but a loss control assessment, which is primarily focused on injury prevention. So it's definitely related to safety, but not OSHA compliance, and there's a big difference between the two. Number 2, your loss control agent typically has a book of hundreds of clients and therefore has no time to manage OSHA compliance for any given company, nor do they have the expertise typically. So again, they don't have the time to even do it, even if you wanted them to do it. Number 3, workers' comp carriers, they'll offer a lot of generic safety resources to their clients, like training videos, templates, etc. But the problem is, again, these are generic resources, yet OSHA requires that every company develop customized training, customized policies and procedures, etc., to address the company-specific health and safety hazards at a given company. And these generic resources just don't do that. They don't meet that standard. So really, for a company to make that work, they'd have to go in there, take these generic resources and somehow adapt them and customize them to their company. But you can't do that with a training video. It's just impossible. I've even asked this question to a local OSHA enforcement person, whether these generic resources meet the standard, and the answer is no. It's impossible. And again, I made the same mistake when I had my wind business. I'll never forget when I met with my loss control agents the first time, and they showed me the portal to all these free generic resources, and it gave me this false sense of security that somehow we were covered because we had access to all these generic resources. And to be honest with you, that was probably the last time I ever logged onto that page, that resource page. And I think a lot of companies fall victim to that. They see that they have access to all these resources and they somehow feel like now they're in compliance, but it couldn't be further from the truth. Okay, so another common mistake that we see is
Companies who use OSHCON often get the false sense that this covers their OSHA compliance requirements, but again, it doesn't for very similar reasons to the insurance issue. And I don't mean to discount OSHCON. This is a fantastic resource, but don't mistake it for managing your OSHA compliance, because it doesn't. And here's why. They also offer a lot of generic resources, which again have to be adapted to your custom company specific health and safety hazards. So very similar to the problem with the workers' comp resources. And then the other big reason is that OSHCON also has no mandate to manage OSHA compliance for a company, only to conduct annual inspections to identify health and safety hazards and then make recommendations for corrective actions. But here's the kicker. But now it's up to that company to actually implement and manage everything over time. Well, OSHCON's not going to do that for you. They'll give you resources, they'll give you feedback, but again, it's up to the company to actually implement and manage those requirements over time, and that's where most companies struggle. We've worked with a lot of different companies who have worked with OSHCON, and they came to this realization eventually that, hey, we've got to manage it now. They can't do it for us. We need help. We can't get this done. Another common misconception about OSHCON is that it's going to protect the company from enforcement and fines and penalties. Again, that's not true. It might be true for that maybe a 2-week period after they do that inspection while they're giving you time to implement corrective actions. But other than that, there is no protection giving. So keep that in mind. It's really important to understand that. Okay, now we'll talk about the fourth most common mistake and myth that we see out there. And that's where companies either buy or download a generic safety manual off the internet typically. So we'll often visit with a company, we'll ask them if they have a safety program and what does that consist of. And oftentimes they'll pull out this massive 3-ring binder with the words health and safety manual on the front. And they'll actually believe that this binder actually constitutes full compliance, which of course it doesn't. And there's a lot of reasons why, but here's the two main reasons. Again, number one, as I alluded to before, OSHA requires customized policies and procedures that are designed to address and manage company-specific health and safety hazards that are different at every company. Whereas these off-the-shelf manuals are, again, totally generic. And to add to that, they often contain a lot of information and standards that don't even apply to a particular company. So if a company is pointing to this as their compliance document, now they're signing up to manage things that don't even apply to what they actually do. And then the other big issue, as I alluded to earlier, it's not just a matter of having written policies and procedures. There are actually what we call elements within each standard that a company actually has to implement and manage on an ongoing basis. And I'm talking about things like routine training, routine inspections, customized lockout, tagout procedures, the hazard assessments I talked about before, and the list goes on and on. There's a lot of stuff in those procedures that you actually have to do, but it's a very common misconception with companies that they don't understand that management implementation piece of things that they have to do on an ongoing basis. And the third point is the fact that, companies often buy these manuals, they put them on the shelf, they collect dust. No one's even bothered to read the manual, so they don't even know what's in there. So that's yet another problem with buying generic or downloading a generic safety manual. It just doesn't cover the standard. Finally, this is kind of self-explanatory, but another common mistake and myth is the idea that, hey, we'll get around to it later. We're working on it. We'll get it done next month, next year. Obviously, you can't tell that to an inspector if they walk in and to inspect your company. You're gonna get cited and nailed all over the place. These requirements, both on the environmental side and on the safety side, you have to implement these things the moment you start operations. And if you haven't and you're behind, you got to get caught up in a hurry. Putting it off till tomorrow only exposes your company to all these risks and liabilities that we've been talking about. Yet we always hear from companies who tell me that they're in the process of making it happen. You got to get to it. You got to get it done. You got to get it wrapped up. Okay, and I'd like to just go ahead and end off on this section by saying, look, I don't mean to sound flippant about any of these issues. Look, I've made just about all these mistakes myself while running my own company, so I know how easy it is to do that. especially for a small company. But again, I want to emphasize the importance of if your company is falling victim to one of these mistakes or myths, just recognize it, acknowledge it, but avoid it by taking action. Failure to do so can lead to all these big problems that we've been talking about. It's all preventable, but we've got to recognize it when we're making mistakes and move forward. Okay, so when you add it all up, here are the 5 most dangerous EHS compliance risks facing small manufacturing companies today. Number 1, OSHA can inspect your business at any time and without warning and issue significant fines and penalties against your company. Number 2, the cost from a single employee accident or injury could irreversibly damage or destroy your business at any moment. Number 3, environmental fines and penalties are not capped and could include personal jail time for both management and ownership. Number 4, businesses are accountable to a multitude of federal, state, and local agencies, each of which enforce a wide range of environmental and hazardous materials rules and regulations. And number 5, a single non-compliance event could stain your company's reputation forever and cost you significantly. All right, so what can be done about this? Well, the only way to manage and minimize these risks is through EHS compliance efforts. And that means for companies without programs, these companies need to implement new programs and begin managing these new programs. And for companies who have existing programs, it's really important to go ahead and validate and improve those programs just to make sure that you're keeping up with current regulations and that you're covering all of your bases. Okay, so why are these EHS compliance efforts so critical? Well, it's pretty simple, and this graph kind of says it all. So EHS compliance efforts equal risk reduction. So in other words, if you're all the way over on the left of this graph with low EHS compliance efforts, your risk level is at its absolute maximum, and you're literally rolling the dice on a day-to-day basis, just hoping that nothing bad is going to happen. But the good news is that as you start to make these compliance efforts, and you move towards the right, your risk levels are going to come down proportionately. Of course, you can never bring your risk level down to zero, but huge gains and improvements can be made in this area. And we've seen a lot of companies do that and really benefit from those efforts. Okay, so pardon me, how exactly do you do this? How do you implement and improve these EHS compliance efforts? Well, now during the presentation, we're going to shift our focus to talking about just that. And we're going to do it by talking about the 7 keys to managing compliance. And I identified these through the research and also through my own experience dealing with these issues. So I'm going to go through each one of these in great detail so you have an idea of exactly what I'm talking about. And here we go. So number 1, obviously you want to be looking for experience. You need to have experienced and qualified EHS professionals or a team of experts to help you manage these issues. And some of the basic requirements that you want to look for, a minimum of 5 to 10 years of experience in environmental health and safety. Ideally, the person is going to have a 4-year degree from an accredited university, either in safety and or environmental issues. There are programs out there, not a lot of them, but there are a few programs out there. And ideally, they might have if they have a graduate degree, that's even better. It's good to have somebody with industrial hygiene experience to help deal with health exposures that most manufacturing companies have, excessive noise, chemical exposures, how to measure that, how to manage that, and so forth. You want to get someone who really understands hazard recognition. So we'll talk more about that in the inspection section here in a minute, but the person needs to understand how to identify health and safety hazards and how to abate them to meet the standards. You want to have somebody with at least 5 years of training experience. Training is a really tricky thing. It requires a unique skill set, a unique individual who not only knows the technical standards, but also engages the audience, is approachable, etc. We'll talk more about that in a minute here, but it's also very key. Also keep in mind that what you're going to find is that these professionals typically either focus on the safety side or the environmental side. It's very rare to be able to find somebody who can really do both. Believe me when I tell you, that's one of our biggest challenges. But I've been in recruiting, interviewing, and hiring EHS people for many years, and it's very tough to find good qualified people that can really manage all these issues. I've written about this extensively in blogging and so forth. I can't go into all the details right now, but these people are hard to find, and if you do find them, you're going to spend a lot of money on salary. They know that they're in high demand, and they command high compensation. So just be aware of that. Number two, audits and inspections. And we'll start off talking about inspections for both safety and environmental issues. So on the safety side, again, as we've talked about, OSHA requires that you conduct routine inspections to identify health and safety hazards and abate them. Very important that you do that on a routine basis. And then on the environmental side, it triggers too. So a lot of the environmental regulations like stormwater pollution prevention plan, spill prevention, countermeasure, and control plans require routine inspections and abatements and so forth. So you've got to conduct these routine inspections to maintain compliance. And then, of course, you have to conduct audits, and audits give you the opportunity to accomplish three things, really: assess, verify, and improve. So on the assessment side, the only means to assess a company's compliance condition is to conduct audits. Number two, verify. So if you do have programs in place, the audits will verify whether they are complete and address all of the compliance requirements that trigger your company. And then improve. So audits will make note of any gaps in your programs and violations, and then make recommendations for formal corrective action so that you can implement those corrective actions and manage them on an ongoing basis and manage compliance. Okay, and then you need to have customized written programs. And we've kind of touched on this before, but let me dive a little bit deeper into this. And I'll talk about the safety side and the environmental side briefly. So on the safety side, again, you've got to have policies and procedures that address the specific health and safety hazards that exist at your company. And the way that OSHA does this, I mean, this is a big topic, but let me try to summarize here. So they'll have standards for all the typical health and safety hazards that exist. So they'll have a standard for fall protection. They'll have a standard for hazard communication. They'll have a standard for personal protective equipment. They'll have a standard for powered industrial trucks, i.e. forklifts, etc. So all those standards that trigger for your company based on your specific health and safety hazards need to be included in your written programs. And then they need to contain all the elements like training and inspections and so forth that we talked about before. But you don't want to have any standards in your policies and procedures that don't apply to your company. For example, you might not need a hearing conservation program. You might not need a respiratory protection program. It just depends. So you have to assess what your company has in place, and then you have to write policies and procedures around that to only identify and deal with the issues at your company. On the environmental side, it's a little bit different. So the written programs are triggered by the specific regulations. So for example, if you've got to deal with stormwater, then you've got to write a plan, a stormwater pollution prevention plan that's customized to your company, that has a map, for example, of your actual company. It's got the outfalls, it's got all the various buildings, etc. And if they change over time, you've got to update your map. So that stormwater pollution prevention plan is customized to your actual business. Same thing for SPCC. If you exceed the threshold for oil storage and you need to control the possibility of spilling, and again, that plan needs to be written around your specific company. On the waste management side, if you're a small quantity or a large quantity waste generator of hazardous waste, you've got to write a lot of procedures to make sure that you're meeting all of the RCRA requirements. So there's more, but I just want to give you kind of an idea of what we mean by customized written programs for both safety and environmental. All right, now we're going to talk about employee training, and we're going to do kind of a deep dive here because the training requirements are key to managing compliance. There's also a lot of misconceptions and misunderstandings about what's required on the training side. We're going to talk about both safety and environmental, but we're going to focus mostly on the safety side because those training requirements are much more extensive and again, a lot of misconceptions there. So let's start off by talking about the different categories of safety training types that are out there, and there's three of them. Number one, and most important, is the formal OSHA standards training that I'll talk more about in a minute. Number two, there's an option to do orientation training. And then number three, there are toolbox or tailgate training. I'm going to talk about each of these. Start off by talking about formal OSHA training requirements. They're extensive, and again, there's a lot of misconceptions about what OSHA requires of companies. So you have to train each applicable standard that triggers at your company based on your company's specific health and safety hazards, like we talked about before. So, for example, hazard communication, fall protection, hearing conservation, PPE, etc. Now, a typical manufacturing company is going to trigger anywhere between 8 and 12 standards that need to be trained. And each one of these standards is going to take 30 to 60 minutes each to properly train. Let's say 45 minutes on average. And here's one of the key misconceptions. This training must be customized, okay? So generic training is not allowed. And I've touched on this before, but a lot of companies make the mistake of either using generic training videos or subscribing to something online that doesn't meet the standard. Okay, so what those generic options do is they cover the meat and potatoes, for lack of a better term, of the actual standard, which is great, and that's important and required. But then there needs to be a second component in your training that actually addresses your company's specific hazards. And a perfect example of that is hazard communication. So once you covered what the HAZCOM standard says, now you've got to address the actual chemicals, for example, that are used in your workplace. Your employees need to understand the hazards of those chemicals, the pictograms, et cetera, and how to manage, the PPE around them, et cetera. So your training needs to contain a company-specific component. Generic training is not allowed, a very common mistake that we see out there. OSHA also introduced a comprehension standard a few years ago, and basically what it says is that employees actually need to understand what was trained to them. So it's not enough just to set them down in front of a computer screen to roll through a bunch of generic training and then have them sign off on something. They need to actually understand the training. So it's a good idea to test them on their comprehension. If they didn't get it, run them through it again. But believe me, if you get a comprehensive inspection from OSHA, they're going to likely conduct confidential interviews with your staff, and they'll quiz them. They'll find out if they really understood, the training. And I'm going to use HAZCOM as an example again, because that's something that they typically scrutinize. They're going to sit down with your employees and say, hey, were you trained on hazard communication? And if so, did your employer train you on the specific chemicals that exist at your company? Do you understand what the different pictograms mean, et cetera? So they're really going to dig down and figure out, did you really properly train your employees, and did they understand the training, and did they meet this comprehension standard? So it's really important. Another real common mistake that companies make. A lot of these training standards have an annual recurring requirement, so you've got to train it to all your employees every year, and emergency response is a good example of that. But all of the standards are recommended to be trained annually. So if you're serious about managing safety at your company, you want to train every one of these 8 to 12 standards every single year. So when you add it all up, and especially when you turn in or account for employee turnover that a lot of manufacturers deal with, training becomes literally a never-ending process. It needs to be scheduled into your company process, baked into your company process. That training has to happen on a continual basis. It never ends if you want to maintain compliance. And if you don't, again, you're exposing yourself to all these different citations and so forth. Something that a lot of companies really struggle to keep up with. Okay, now let's talk about orientation training. So now that we've talked about the formal OSHA standards training, you see how extensive it is. You got to train, between 8 and 12 topics that are going to take about 45 minutes each. How are you going to train, a new employee when you hire them? That's tough for a lot of companies. So a potential workaround to deal with that is what we call an orientation training. And what an orientation training would be, it could be built in PowerPoint or a video. And what it does is it covers basic summary information on all those 8 to 12 standards that apply to your company, right? So I want to make sure that we're clear on this. This does not meet the OSHA standard, but it's a lot better than nothing. Before, when you hire a new employee and before you deploy them out to the job floor. And the reason that you at least want to do this, if you can't fully train them before they go to work, the fact is that a high percentage of serious employee injuries and fatalities actually occur within the first few hours or days that an employee goes to work for a company, because they literally have no idea what the safety hazards are out there. So they walk into the jaws of death because they never even knew that hazard was there. It's very dangerous and very risky, not only for the employee, but for the company. You have to do some sort of a training before you send them out on the job floor, and an orientation module is a good way to do that. But again, it just covers the basics of each standard that triggers your company. It's not going to be customized. It's not going to meet the full standard. You wouldn't want to rely on this if you're going to get it inspected, but it's a lot better than nothing, and a lot of companies rely on this as an option. Then we're going to end off by talking about what are called toolbox or tailgate training. These are small 10 to 15 minute sessions, typically delivered by a supervisor or a manager. They don't cover the full standard. They'll just cover a very specific hazard. For example, how to use a ladder, how to clean a ladder, that kind of thing. Very simple, short training topics. And the value of these is that they keep safety kind of top of mind with your employees. They help build that culture of safety. But what's really important to understand is that these training sessions do not meet the formal OSHA standards. And you should probably see why by now after we've talked about this. But another real common mistake that we hear out there and see out there is companies who are doing these tailgate trainings, and they falsely believe that this is meeting the OSHA standard, but it is definitely not meeting that OSHA standard. Okay, now that we've covered the safety requirements, I'll just briefly touch on the environmental safety requirements. They're not as extensive, but they're still very important. And a lot of the regulations trigger a training requirement. So stormwater triggers annual training requirements. SPCC does. Hazardous waste management triggers an annual training requirement. DOT and IATA triggers recurring training requirements. So again, not as extensive as the health and safety side of things, but still very important. Okay, and then the fifth key to managing compliance is staying current with regulatory changes. So again, this can be tricky. So every year, OSHA has updates. The various environmental agencies have updates to their regulations. And so what you want to do is you have to monitor these agencies, subscribe to their email updates, and you got to read these things, and you just got to keep up and make note of the changes, and then figure out, do these changes even impact my company? If they do, then you've got to figure out a way to implement those changes into your company and manage those changes into your company. So I'll give you a few examples. I'll start with on the safety side. So one of the big ones that happened with OSHA that a lot of companies are still out of compliance with, by the way, is they did a major update to the hazard communication standard several years ago to meet the globally harmonized system. And so really one of the big changes there was an update to the format of safety data sheets. They used to be called material safety data sheets. Now they're called safety data sheets as of that update. And you've got to train your employees on how to read these new safety data sheets, the pictograms, et cetera. So that was a major update that happened a few years ago that, again, we routinely hear from companies who haven't implemented that yet. Another big one that changed is silica exposure. So companies who have silica in their process, the exposure levels basically dropped in half. And that can be a very difficult thing for companies to manage. Again, it doesn't apply to every manufacturing company, but a lot of manufacturing companies it does. And so you need to be aware of that. And if it impacts your company, you've got to implement it. On the environmental side, there's always changes. Typically, they're pretty small changes. There might be a reporting change date for annual reporting, for example. There might be tweaks to training requirements. On the environmental side, they seem to be smaller changes, more administrative changes. But again, if you want to maintain compliance, you got to keep up with them. And if they happen and they trigger your company, you've got to be aware of them and you've got to implement them. So it's tough to do that unless you have somebody dedicated to that task, either an internal manager or a consulting company has got to be doing that for you. Because if you try to dual task one of your staff managers to keep up, you're going to have a hard time managing this, staying current with regulatory changes. This is very difficult to do that. Okay, then the sixth key to managing compliance is ongoing program maintenance. And really, this is the thing that most companies really struggle with. And really, it comes down to doing all the things described above on an ongoing basis. So What we typically see is that companies will, do something. They'll have a training session. They'll do forklift training. They'll implement a stormwater pollution prevention plan. They'll do one thing, right? And then everything just sort of stops. What companies really need to understand, and why this is a key to managing compliance, is that companies really need to understand that these things, managing compliance is a never-ending, ongoing process. And again, it includes all the things that we talked about up above, like conducting regular audits and inspections, conducting ongoing employee training, making sure that your safety program and environmental programs are up to date and correct, and staying up to date on regulatory changes, etc. And again, in order to make sure that this happens, the company really needs to assign these responsibilities to someone who is qualified and experienced to do that, and ensure that this process is managed on a regular basis. And if this doesn't happen, then again, the whole program is doomed to failure. It's a never-ending process. I can't emphasize that enough. It needs to be something that a company lives with and practices on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis. If you lose track of it, you lose focus on it, it falls apart. It's got to be something that's literally built and baked into your daily process. I don't know how else to state it, but to make it happen, that's sort of the outlook and the perspective that you have to keep on this. Okay, and that discussion is actually a perfect transition into talking about our seventh and final key to managing compliance, which is actually the most important key to managing compliance, and you'll understand why in a minute here. And that key is what we call management commitment. And I say here, management commitment or die, because without it, any EHS program, especially at a small company, is doomed to either a quick or a slow and painful death. And you'll understand why as we move on here. And so don't get me wrong, the idea or the concept that management commitment is key to successfully managing compliance is certainly nothing new. But my research combined with my own experiences really showed me how important this issue is, especially when it comes to managing compliance at small companies. And keep in mind, at big companies, big manufacturing companies, big enterprise companies, that management commitment is almost always there, because CEOs of these companies, they get the value proposition. And I'm actually going to talk more about that in a minute. But in a lot of small companies, they just don't understand the value proposition. And that's kind of one of my goals here in this presentation, is try to convey that value proposition. Okay, so before getting too far ahead of myself, let me explain what I mean by management commitment in this context. Okay, so underlying this whole concept is the fact that managing EHS compliance is not easy for any company, whether it's big or small, for all the reasons we've been talking about, but also because, among other things, it's inconvenient, it's expensive, and it's disruptive. In other words, you have to hire expensive experts, either an internal EHS manager or a consulting company to manage everything. You have to pull employees off the production line to make time for training, which can result in production delays, added payroll costs. You have to pay for expensive safety gear and environmental equipment like scrubbers and so forth to manage air emissions, and the list goes on and on. And as I said before, it's a never-ending process which only compounds these issues. But despite all these challenges, the company must push through and persevere on a daily, weekly, monthly basis to make sure that it gets done. And in a nutshell, that's what I mean when I talk about management commitment. So without that top-down management commitment from ownership and senior management, this stuff's all really doomed to failure. Okay, so let me end off by briefly talking about my own professional and personal experiences dealing with management commitment issues with my companies. Not sure if you're aware of it or not, but I had an oil field services company and a wind energy services company. And both these companies expose my employees to major safety hazards on a daily basis. I'm talking about working 250 feet up in the air, around large moving parts, high voltage electricity, crowded drilling pads, etc. So here's how I summarize my management commitment both to myself and to my employees. I said, look, none of my employees are going to get seriously injured or killed on my watch. And if that happens, it's going to be despite all my best efforts. And so, I made a lot of mistakes along the way. It was a steep learning curve. But I'll give myself credit, for backing up that management commitment by literally spending tens of thousands of dollars on safety during that time period, on safety managers, safety training, buying expensive safety gear, attending conferences to educate myself about how to manage safety with the companies. And it really worked out for us during that time period. Luckily, we had no serious injuries, no fatalities, whereas both industries had a lot of that going on during that time period. So this is how I dealt with that risk. I couldn't live with myself if any of my employees would have gotten seriously injured or killed as a result of my own negligence. I wasn't going to allow that to happen. So I understood that responsibility, and I feel like I managed it, fairly well. But it was tough. So I'll end off with that, other than to say that, again, at large companies, that management commitment to EHS is almost always there, because these companies, these CEOs, CFOs, and owners and so forth, they understand that value proposition. So for the remainder of the presentation here, I'm just going to talk about that value proposition and a lot of the benefits that your company can reap by backing up EHS programs at your company. Okay, and with that said, let's talk about how compliance will protect and improve your business. Let's talk more about that that value proposition that I've been referring to throughout this presentation. I will start here. So save money and cut costs. When most companies think about the costs associated with injuries and illness and accidents, they just think of the medical costs. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. The real costs are made up of all the direct and indirect costs listed below here, which end up costing U.S. employers an average of $140 billion with a B every single year, believe it or not. And I'll talk briefly about each of these, starting from the top. So retraining costs for lost employees. So if you lose an employee to a serious injury, now you got to recruit a new employee. You got to train them. Obviously, that's very time consuming and expensive. That's an indirect cost. It's hard to capture exactly what that costs companies, but it's compounded if that lost employee is a key employee for your company, a manager or a supervisor. That can be really expensive for a business. To the left there, damaged equipment and property. A lot of times when you have accidents and injuries, you damage equipment. That especially happens. We see that with forklift accidents. Increased workers' compensation premiums, EMR. I'm actually going to talk in more detail about that in a minute. Lost productivity, work stoppages and safety stand downs, accident investigations, implementation of corrective actions. Those three are kind of all lumped together. Miscellaneous legal cost. Over on the left, lost customers. In a lot of businesses, big customers really scrutinize EHS performance, and if your company can't meet their standards, you can lose business. And we saw that happen a lot in the energy services field that I talked about before. Over on the right, injury-related civil lawsuits. We talked about that earlier. Those settlements can run into the millions of dollars. And then, of course, on the bottom, OSHA fines and penalties, and also environmental fines and penalties can be very, very expensive for a company. Okay, so moving on with the theme of save money and cut costs. This slide is going to summarize some very commonly accepted but very important safety-related financial ROI statistics. And basically each one of these statistics is going to demonstrate how the cost of prevention is much less expensive than the alternative. So we're going to slice and dice those facts up in these different statistics here. So number one, as a starting point, again, U.S. companies lose $140 billion to accidents and injuries every year, and all those direct and indirect costs that we just talked about. So each serious injury or fatality is 48 times more expensive than the cost of prevention. All right. And each serious injury will cost a company between $20,000 and $80,000. And again, those calculations are made up of all those direct and indirect costs that we talked about in the iceberg slide. Each prevented lost time injury or illness will save a company $37,000. Again, all those direct and indirect costs that we've been talking about. Each prevented fatality will save a company almost $1.4 million. So fatalities are a whole different animal, boy. Not only are they tragic and costly for obviously the employee and their family, but it's also extremely expensive for a company, especially a small company that might not survive a fatality event. And then finally, over 60% of chief financial officers state that for every dollar invested in injury prevention, it returns between $2 and $4.41 each. So that's more than a 2-time ROI on injury prevention investments. Okay, so now let's talk about how EHS can actually help you to grow your business. So if you want to kind of move yourself up the food chain, so to speak, against your competitors, improving your EHS efforts is a great way to do that, to impress and get new, bigger clients and keep your existing clients happy. So in summary, I mean, customers want to do business with compliant vendors. They want to do business with companies who take EHS seriously because they want to, reduce their own risk and manage their own their own company's reputation. And by only doing business with companies who take EHS seriously, that's a really good way to do that. Also, customers can drop vendors with poor EHS performance. And we saw that a lot in the energy sector, but it happens in manufacturing as well. So I don't know if you've run into this before, but a lot of times these big companies who take this stuff seriously, they'll ask, they'll scrutinize your EHS performance. They'll ask for your KPIs, your TRIR score, your DART score, your EMR scores, and if you don't meet their standards, they might give you the opportunity to fix that problem, but that can take a long time. Or they might just cut you off and say, look, I'm sorry, but we can't do business with you anymore. And once that happens, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to get that work back. And for manufacturing companies who want to go above and beyond, it's worthwhile looking at the ISO certifications, the 14,000 for environmental, 18,000 for safety, or the new 45,000 standard. Again, big companies want to do business with vendors who take this stuff seriously. So if you have those management systems in place and you have those certifications in place, that is a great way, again, to move yourself up the food chain and to grow your business. Okay, so let's talk about another EHS ROI opportunity, and that's the opportunity to reduce employee turnover. Look, we all understand the importance of trying to maintain a stable workforce and reduce turnover. Turnover just adds cost, inefficiencies, nightmares, etc. And a lot of manufacturing companies struggle with that. So whatever you can do to attack that problem is going to obviously help your company. Okay, so employees regularly rank feeling safe and having a safe workplace as one of the top 10 factors in job satisfaction. I don't know if you knew that or not, but that's a fact. And employees want to work with companies who take safety and compliance seriously. So just think about that. So if an employee works at a company where they're constantly seeing these safety hazards, they bring it up, management doesn't do anything about it. They don't get safety PPE, they don't get safety glasses, whatever those problems might look like at a company. Why would they want to work for that company if they don't take safety seriously? Why would they want to put themselves at risk? It just doesn't make a lot of sense, right? And also, when you're trying to recruit new talent and new people to your company, a related issue, if they do a search on the internet for a company and they find out about company X having been fined by OSHA or some environmental agency, again, why would they want to go to work for that company when they go to work for another company down the road? It's never been cited. So again, improving EHS compliance at a company is a great way to tackle this problem of employee turnover and shouldn't be overlooked. Another major benefit of safety that a lot of manufacturing companies aren't aware of is its impact on quality. So it's a proven and accepted fact that quality performance and safety performance actually go hand in hand. So if you want to improve quality performance of your company, then a really good, effective way to do that is to focus on improving safety. So if you want to reduce things like reworks, reduce scrap, reduce customer complaints, then again, focus on improving safety, and those quality improvements will follow. So at the end of the day, the idea is that employees who are focused on being safe are going to also be focused on improving quality. Again, they move hand in hand. There are a lot of white papers out there and studies on the internet that support this, so might be worth looking into that. Okay, we're just about wrapping up here, but let me talk about another major opportunity for cost savings, and that's your workers' compensation premium, which is dependent upon your EMR, your experience modification rate. Some companies know about this. A lot of companies that we talk to actually don't understand how this works. So let me explain this. So your EMR compares your claim history with your competitors. It rewards companies who have lower losses and good safety performance, while at the same time it penalizes companies with poor safety performance. So a high EMR can result in up to a 3-time higher premium than what your competitors are paying. So let me explain real briefly how this works here. So if your EMR is 1, that basically means that you're paying what underwriters think that your company should pay for workers' compensation coverage based on your industry, number of employees, location, etc. So if you have really good safety performance, your EMR could go below 1. It could be a 0.9, for example. And in that case, you're actually getting a 10% discount on your workers' compensation premium. A 0.8, you're getting a 20% discount. Now, on the flip side, if your EMR is 1.1, for example, now you're paying a 10% penalty. If it's a 1.5, you're paying a 50% penalty. And we've seen EMRs as high as 3, which again means that you're paying 3 times what you should be paying for workers' compensation coverage. And again, for a company with big payroll, even a company with small payroll, that can be devastating for a company. And the problem is, once your EMR gets up there, it takes several years to bring it back down. And that's assuming that you're able to reduce your claims and your injury rates. So again, workers' compensation costs are completely dependent upon your safety performance and injury prevention, and can be a major nightmare for companies who lose sight of that and allow their EMR to creep up. You just can't let that happen. You can't pay that price. Okay, and then let's wrap up here by talking about other benefits of being compliant. Number 1, again, you'll be prepared for surprise inspections. You get that call from the lobby, hey, OSHA's in the lobby. Are you going to be panicked, or are you going to feel like you're ready? You get a lot of peace of mind by knowing that you're going to be ready for that inspector, whether it's an OSHA inspector or an environmental inspector. Knowing that you've done all that you can to ensure a safe workplace for your employees. Again, I talked about that earlier with my own situation. Nobody wants to have that on their conscience, that their negligence led to the injury or the, God forbid, fatality of an employee. That can just be devastating, not only for leadership, but also for the other employees and for morale, etc. You just obviously don't want that to ever happen. Enhance and protect your company's reputation. Boy, we've talked about that over and over again. I don't need to talk about that again. And again, most of all, you're going to have peace of mind. When I talk to a lot of our clients, that's really what they're looking for, is peace of mind. They're just tired of worrying about this stuff. They want to put it to bed. They want to get it dealt with. That's just a huge benefit. So you add up this whole final section of this presentation. That's the value proposition that I've been talking about. That's why big companies have strong leadership management commitment. They understand the importance of all this to maintain the long-term stability and sustainability of the company, and to make sure that it survives over time. This stuff is EHS is key to helping to ensure that actually happens. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up the report itself. I really hope that you found this information to be helpful. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the report, I really also hope that this succeeds in motivating and encouraging listeners to actually take steps towards achieving compliance and reducing risk at their company. Look, I know there's a lot of information here. There's a lot of scary stuff in here. But one of the other key findings of my research is that the fact that there's actually a proven formula to help companies to address these issues and solve this problem. And so for people who are interested in learning more about that and how to achieve these goals, I have a couple of offers here. And I'll also share with you my direct phone number and my email address in case you have any questions about the report and about these offers. So here's our first free offer. Are you compliant or are you at risk? It's time for a checkup. So what we're offering to do is to quickly assess your company's current compliance condition and risk potential by completing a free summary EHS compliance assessment. And among other things, what we're going to do is conduct a facility inspection to identify health and safety hazards at your company, review your health and safety policies and procedures if you have them, to see if they address all those company-specific hazards like we talked about throughout the report. Review your employee training requirements, both safety and environmental training requirements and records. your record keeping requirements, your OSHA 300 logs, and also conduct a summary environmental compliance review to see what might trigger at your company and what you may or may not have in place. So we've conducted these assessments for many small manufacturers. It's completely confidential, no obligation. It's really one of our free resources that we try to offer to the local business community to help companies get educated about these compliance requirements and risks. It takes about an hour to complete. We can do it on site or actually remotely, whatever makes sense. We have a button here below the video where you can schedule that to happen, and I strongly encourage you to do that. Here's the other thing we want to tell you about. This is our outsourced partnership solution that we call Assured Compliance, and this is really contains that formula for solving this problem the problems that we've been talking about today. So this is our proven and proprietary solution for small manufacturers to achieve compliance and reduce risk. What it does is it keeps your company in line with EHS regulatory requirements that we've been talking about. And of course, that includes safety and environmental and hazardous materials. I point that out because a lot of consulting companies either focus on safety or environmental, but not both. So that's pretty unique to our company. And it protects your business from the potentially devastating risks associated with non-compliance. And as part of our service, we actually offer an OSHA compliance guarantee. So what that means is if OSHA comes out and they inspect you and they cite you for something that we missed, we're actually on the hook to help pay for fines and penalties and defend you through that whole enforcement process at no additional charge. That's pretty unique to our industry. So if you're out there talking to other consulting companies, I strongly encourage you to ask them if they offer any sort of a performance guarantee. That's pretty rare in our industry. And all for 50 to 75% less than the cost of hiring an in-house EHS manager, believe it or not. And again, you're going to get access to our entire team of experts rather than relying on a single individual. And of course, there's a lot of benefits that go along with that. So we'll have a video here at the end, a link to another video here at the end that'll tell you more about Assured Compliance if you're interested in learning more about that service. Or again, you're free to contact me directly. Here's my email address, my direct phone number. I look forward to hearing from you soon. And thanks again for listening, and I hope you have a good day.